Right. All right, so good afternoon, everyone. It's really great to be able to see both familiar names and new names here today. We are AALL, but we know we have many other people who are not part of our membership participating, and that's great. My name is Alice Lee, and I'm a member of the AALL PD committee, along with Steve Capitelli, our captain. Raise your hand. And May Kojatafe, in our second season with us in the committee, and Tiana Blazevich. And a very warm welcome to everyone coming to the second session of the 2023 Connect Inspire Share, which is now in its fourth season. I'd like to start with acknowledgement of country. In the spirit of reconciliation, we acknowledge the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea, and community. We pay our respects to the elders, past and present, extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people today. I'm speaking to you from Barangay country. Please feel free to put in chat what land you're joining us from. Hello, hello. So today's session topic is titled, How do we make better decisions in higher education? And we're going to be exploring with John some of the major myths of higher education and how to move to evidence-based practices using presentation design as a prime example. This session will be divided into two parts with Q&A time at the end of each part. So please feel free to put your questions into chat to be addressed at the appropriate time. So our speaker today is John Mahoney. He is the academic lead of Australian Catholic University's Inspire project, which seeks to enhance the student experience by helping educators make evidence-based decisions. John is a psychologist by training with an interest in human motivation and teaches undergraduate and postgraduate subjects that focus on human flourishing, especially student flourishing. He's won numerous teaching awards, and we're very, very glad to have him speak to us today. So over to you, John.
Thank you. And thank you for having me along, colleagues. It's really wonderful to be here. I rarely get to do presentations cross universities, so it's nice to step outside the four walls of ACU for a change. And thank you for that very kind introduction, Alice. Very honored to have you introduce me. It's very kind. So I just want to check, Alice, because I can see you most prominently on my screen. Can you see my slides? Are they coming through at your end?
Yep.
Fantastic. I think Alice did a really good job of kind of describing the rough plan for today, but I've got three sections that we're going to try to go through. I'm hoping that we can make this a little bit interactive. I'm going to ask a few questions, but you can, kind of make use of whatever forum you want to try to communicate. You can use the chat feature. You can take yourself off mute, you can put up your hand. We don't have to be too formal about what we do, whatever you feel most comfortable doing. Alice described my role at ACU, at least anyway, which is to lead Inspire, which is, I'm going to focus a little bit on what Inspire is at the back end of this presentation, but it tries to lean pretty heavily on I guess, my discipline skill set. And it was kind of the brainchild of me and another couple of people at ACU. And it's kind of started as a very small project and then got rapidly out of hand. And we're very quickly trying to catch up with the need of the people who are using it. So hopefully showing you what it's kind of all about at the end will give you a bit of a flavor and a sense of what you might do with it. Most of the time I do present to, I guess, academics or faculty. So people kind of working in the staff with, in the trenches with students. And so when we kind of talked about doing this presentation, a lot of the discussion was, make sure it's appropriate for this group. I think that you guys are equally as much in the trenches as anybody else, to be honest. So I'm not going to alter the presentation too much than what I would do for any other group of educators. I think we're all kind of doing the same thing. We all have the same kind of outcome in mind. But please share your stories, if anything, is what I would encourage. This is when my work comes to life, is when people like who are represented here today talk about what their experiences are of the information I'm going to go through. So that's my way of a little bit of an introduction. In terms of setting the stage a little bit, I wouldn't be an academic unless I started with a kind of an advanced planner of what we're going to go through. We've got three things. I want to talk a little bit very briefly about really persistent myths in learning, a lot of which I imagine this group will know better than most other groups in higher education. So I want to explore what some of those myths are, maybe some really simple strategies that a lot of people have shown to be effective to overcoming some of these myths, or alternatives to what we sometimes do to perpetuate these myths. I'm going to go through a bit of a showcase of presentation, like how do we deliver content in a way that it actually sticks with students? What should we think about when we're constructing content and a message and a story, whether it's in a tutorial, whether it's in a one-on-one session with the student, whether it's in a lecture, whether it's in the online asynchronous space, face-to-face, whatever. What does the science of learning tell us about how to design presentation? Something that tends to be quite universal. And the final thing I'm going to focus on is really the work of Inspire and thinking about, well, how can we make better decisions quicker in higher education? So the second point is one of those, I guess, focus areas of how we might make better decisions. But we don't just do presentations. We provide feedback. We construct curriculum. We have to apply policy. We have to consider the students who are in front of us, whether they have particular learning needs or whether they are completely distanced. So how do we make better decisions in higher education will be the last focus. I'm going to ask a little bit of participation as we go through. I would love it if you engage and share your stories and ideas. That would be great. So let's start here with some persistent myths about student learning. I think this one is probably one of the most well-known myths, but it is what's often referred to as like a zombie idea, right? This is one of these probably well-known myths that just simply won't die. It kind of just lingers around and kind of comes after us, groaning all the time. And that's the idea of learning styles. So there's an assumption often, and it still persists even after about 30 years of evidence, that if a student has a desired learning style, so they like to learn with, let's say, particularly like to have a lot of auditory learning, if that's their preferred style, that's the way that we should try to alter our learning or teaching to suit that particular style. We know after a considerable amount of research that that's not the case. We know, for example, with presentations, which I'm going to go through in the second part of this 3 parts presentation, is that presentations work best when we try to tap into 2 modes of learning, which is our auditory modality and our visual modality. And there's really good neuroscience about why that is. We'll kind of explore that a little bit more. Another really good example, particularly, I guess, in my area of health sciences, is that there are a lot of manual skills or physical skills that a lot of professionals do, that they learn on the job at university. Sometimes they learn some of these skills at school. And those skills are almost impossible to learn with just visual and auditory channels. They often need demonstration. They often need the touch and the feel of, for example, taking blood pressure. You need to know how to put on a cuff. You need to know how to release the valve. You need to know how to actually do those things. So the learning requires quite engaged aspects. So I'm going to stop there and I'm going to ask, is this a persistent myth in your experiences? Do you think that this is something that still exists? Where have you seen it without naming names? Can anybody draw on any examples where they've seen colleagues or heard of rumors and stories about people still applying this quite dated myth?
I haven't heard it for a while, John, but I've certainly heard it. I think most people, in university settings are sort of on to what you're saying, in that it's a bit of a throwback to some thoughts from a earlier time, and that if anything, that if we do have preferred styles, we tend to apply it situationally rather than as a blanket thing, right? So sometimes I might prefer to engage with something in an audio way, or sometimes I need to be tactile if it's a machine. Or I think we adapt, don't we? Is that what the research says?
Yeah, the research is, and I think you're hitting at this right, Steve, in the sense that instead of trying to design learning for learners, design learning for learning, right? So if you're doing a practical skill, use practical skill modalities, right? Which tend to be some visual aspects, maybe some fewer auditory aspects, but we still need a little bit of that, and then a bit more touch and feel stuff. If it doesn't involve that, then that's okay. It's really hard, for example, to learn a language without using an auditory modality. So if you're a visual learner, good luck learning French if you've never learned French before. You're not going to pick it up just by reading it, right? It's one of those skills that you really need to listen to and hear and then produce yourself. There's some lovely bits in the chat as well. Some people talking about, yeah, it seems like it's fairly outdated. I did go to a conference, and some of you may have gone to theatre the other week, and Jason Lodge presented. About half the room stuck up their hand in the belief that this was still like a good thing to do, which I kind of tend to agree with most of the things in the chat, which is, yeah, this tends to be outdated. But I was very surprised to see how many people in the room at that conference stuck up their hand to say, yeah, I think that's a good one. Emma, you've got your hand up. What did you want to say?
Ooh. Hi, Emma from Adelaide Uni School of Public Health, also learning advisor at the Writing Centre. I do a lot of work with neurodivergent students, being an absolute spicy brain myself. And one thing I've noticed is that things like ADHD students get distracted really easily and often find it difficult to read large blocks of text. And so they'll say, oh, I don't learn, like I'm not a visual learner. When it's not that they're not a visual learner, like if the text was actually set out in a way that made sense for their brain, they'd be fine. But a lot of them are like, oh no, I'm better as like an oral learner. Like I'm better at learning and listening in conversation. It's like, well, no, it's just easier for you to maintain attention when it's a conversation, when it's just a giant slab of text. And then there are things like, I know that I'm not very good at learning things as a theory and tend to learn better by doing, but that's just because I'm a really stubborn person and I refuse to believe things unless I've experienced them myself. That's less a learning style and more like my weird psychology thing. But I'll often see people saying, oh, I'm a kinesthetic learner, when what they actually mean is I'm too stubborn to believe the experiences of others and need to make the mistakes myself before I learn.
Yeah, look, and there's some great points, Emma, and I think sometimes this conversation can stop short when we forget to talk about things like UDL, Universal Design for Learning, and transition pedagogies, which promote the idea of providing diversity in the learning experience. That's not the same thing. And I think that that's what you're kind of talking to a bit more, Emma. So I agree with that. And that's not the same thing as designing auditory learning activities because a student prefers, they say that I'm an auditory learner, right? That's a very different kind of set of skills. So I'm not saying don't do diversity in terms of the learning activities and the style and the practices, but it is thinking strategically about how do I align those with whatever the learning is, the learning outcomes, the variety of the class. Some more comments in the chat now about some good caring and sharing parts about hearing these things. Someone had to do a VAR questionnaire the other week. How exciting for you. I'm so jealous. So this is a really nice start. And look, if you wanted some of the literature behind it, one of these papers is about the effectiveness or lack thereof with respect to learning styles. And then the other one here is just about the persistent myth. And this one was produced only a couple of years, 3 years ago now, 2020. And so that there is somewhat of a persistent myth here, even though like it's nice to hear this group talk about it. And even Mandy saying, the conversation had an article about this week. It does not die. That is the zombie myth. So that's number one. Number two, and I know Guido loves this one, is this idea that you can learn by highlighting your notes, that you can go back, and I still see students as I walk through libraries sitting there with well-curated lecture resources, not that they develop them, and then just kind of highlighting through them, thinking that this is a good way of revising. This is a somewhat persistent myth. It maybe persists because there's not necessarily a lot of dedicated effort, particularly in school, to develop note-taking skills, and that kind of flows through a little bit to higher education. But there is a considerable amount of research in this area about the value of note-taking and then reviewing notes as a part of revision strategy, as part of learning strategies. And in particular, there's some really wonderful research around the fact that these skills can be developed. And in particular, I think about ACU as a context, the group that we have that really tries to move the door handle on this is our academic skills unit. That's really where our university looks to, and it might be similar for people in other universities. And thinking about the great value of those groups within each university. That's such a kind of wonderful piece that students still come in and they really love highlighting stuff. And there's good research that suggests that doesn't work. This is another really persistent myth, which is the idea that it's really good to prepare for my end of year exams or end of semester exams by studying for my first subject and then doing that exam then waiting, and then do my next study for my next subject, and then do that exam, and then do the next one. Or in other words, kind of cramming for your assessments, right? Kind of doing one piece, one subject, one bit of knowledge, do the assessment, and then move on to the next one. There's, again, a considerable amount of research around the idea of interleaving, and I imagine this group has heard of that idea, but this idea of not just doing A, then chucking that out, then doing B, chucking that out, then doing C, but doing A, B, C, A, B, C, B, C, A in kind of random orders is quite handy and helpful. The research around this one is particularly good when the difference between the subjects is really close together. So when I studied psychology, it was really easy to go from one lecture to the other and think, geez, I just kind of heard this. And if that was kind of your experience, or you know that that happens a lot, particularly in discipline-based or profession-based degrees, this is where interleaving works particularly well, when there is a lot of similarity, a lot of shared space in the learning. And the other aspect here that's important, it's not just about interleaving your learning, but it's also about giving some rest or giving some separation or segmenting that learning, so that it allows you enough time to process what you've taken in, to allow your brain some time to take a break. And again, there's considerable amount of research. We're talking tens, if not hundreds, of papers that have looked at this and thrown a good amount of support around the idea that distributed and interleaving is way better than blocking or cramming. The final myth that I have in this area, which is kind of an evolving one, it's this idea that if I feel comfortable with my learning, if I turn up to class and I really feel like I'm on top of what I'm doing and I'm understanding it, and I'm really just able to kind of sit there and go, yeah, I've got this, that I'm successful as a learner. I'm doing a really good job. I'm learning a lot. When I'm comfortable, I'm learning. We know, particularly in the last 10 years, that there's this wonderful term, you may have heard of it, you may have researched it, you may promote it, which is this idea of desirable difficulties. This is where learning occurs, when we are feeling a desirable level of difficulty. Now, don't get me wrong. If there's an LMS page that is designed so terribly that it's impossible to navigate to find the learning, that is not a desirable difficulty. That is an undesirable difficulty. A desirable difficulty in this context is something that challenges someone's worldview or their conception or their understanding of a topic, right? It's not about, we made it really hard for you to find the learning or to engage with the learning. The challenge here is to press people's understandings of whatever it is that they're engaging in. This one is a particularly hard nut to break, because this doesn't just speak to the kind of nature of being a student, this speaks to a nature of being human. Homeostasis and the desire for homeostasis pushes us to want to be comfortable. We don't like threat, we don't want risk and harm. And so feeling a desirable level of difficulty can reinforce our survival techniques and want us to move away from that. We want to feel comfortable. In a learning context, though, that always seeking out comfortability might mean that we're not necessarily learning. There's some really good research behind that. This is just one of the frameworks that's coming out, and it speaks to me in particular because it's got a lot of psychology behind it in terms of how do we get people to engage from a behavioral point of view when we know that desirable difficulties are kind of particularly good. And I love Mark's comment around, safe spaces and how, or kind of triggering that idea of safe spaces. So desirable difficulties, and indeed, comfortability doesn't necessarily exist on the same continuum as safety. You can make students feel very comfortable with the learning, but very unsafe. And at the same time, you can make them feel like they're engaged in really meaningful, difficult challenges for their learning and feel very safe. So I think that those two concepts, the research would suggest, are orthogonal. So some take-homes from this first part: persistent myths. Design learning that aligns with the learning need, not the learner's needs. That's with the exception of what we talked about in terms of UDL, transition pedagogy. So I'm not suggesting that you don't be diverse in your learning design, but thinking less about the learning styles that students might prefer. Destroy all highlighters. If we could go to your local Officeworks and Staples and just take a flamethrower to the highlighter section, that would be really wonderful. I'm obviously being facetious, but what this group, I imagine, engages in a lot is trying to support students to not only do things like note-taking, but all of those wonderful things that we know will promote their learning. And note-taking is one of those really wonderful things. The one part that I really like in the literature about note-taking is what people who are designing learning can do to promote note-taking. So guided notes, as an example, or supporting students in terms of the resources that they give them. So PowerPoint slides might not always be the best way of promoting note-taking. I love the idea, although I don't think we've nailed it at our university, but I've seen it happen at some other universities, around time management and using technologies that work on the idea of planners to support the idea of interleavering and distributing learning. So there's some wonderful systemic and technological developments that promote the idea of interleavering and distributed learning. And just this week, I presented at ACU, or last week, maybe it was this week, about removing the idea of the review lecture or the review tutorial, that last class of the semester, where let's cover 12 weeks or 10 weeks of learning, right? We're reinforcing the idea of cramming and not supporting the idea of the evidence behind interleavering and distributed learning style. The final thing is about encouraging and rewarding students who seek out challenges and moving away from kind of designs that might promote mediocrity, right? How can we engage students in those desirable difficulties? Design for that in the first place, provide a motivational climate that gives agency for students to work towards those desirable difficulties, and then deliver on that, right? To help them really realize those things. I want to stop there because that's the first part, but let's open the floor to some conversations and some questions. I'll try to go through the chat, but if someone wants to ask a question, take themselves off mute, or make a comment, or give some examples, by all means, or talk about another myth. Floor's open.
I'm quite interested in the encouraging and rewarding students who seek out challenges, particularly because the course I coordinate is our advanced cohort of health and med science students. And so they literally just missed out on like medicine, dentistry, whatever, and they're all very paranoid about their grades. And so they don't want challenges. They want really clear instructions. They essentially want like templates, as like exemplars that are effectively templates for all of their assignments. And I'm really struggling to encourage them to engage and challenge themselves. And well, no, think about what this assessment is asking you to demonstrate in terms of your knowledge and skill, and how do you best do that? Anyone got suggestions? I would love them.
I'll hold my suggestions just in case someone else has some ideas for Emma, and I'm seeing some good comments and questions in the chat as well, so I'll come to those. Anybody want to respond to Emma? Yes, someone has their hand up. Joel, is that your hand up? Did you have a response, Joel?
Are you muted, Joel?
So what I was going to suggest is that in the end, med students are going to have to do diagnosis. So for anything that encourages them to look at situations and say, how do I make sense of this? That kind of challenge, I think, is well worthwhile.
Thanks, Joel. That's lovely. Emma, I have been trying to keep pace a little bit with what's been happening in the States since COVID. And I think one of the evolutions that we might see, maybe in a first year space in particular, is a move. I don't think America is going to come back from this. A lot of them, particularly the big universities, have gone to this, but a move to pass fail, in particular in first year. And the anecdotal evidence so far on that is that academics are speaking about how many more risks students are taking because they don't have the pressure of making sure that they get a high distinction or a distinction. Now, I don't necessarily know how that applies for, in your context where students might actually need grades in order to kind of move, right? There might be some other considerations in there. But I think what the idea is talking to here is that having grades really puts pressure on, it reoriented students towards the things that doesn't allow them to take risks. It actually encourages them to be very safe, not engage in desirable difficulties, try to find the comfort areas, right? So that's almost moving them away from learning. So I'm kind of watching that with interest to see what happens. There's a lot of research that I imagine will come out in the next couple of years talking about what happens when we just go to pass fail, what are the risks that students take. and what's the kind of benefits and maybe risks of doing that as well, right?
Yeah, I've been reading up on ungraded courses because quite frankly, it sounds phenomenal. And if I had the time and the resources, I would absolutely go into that to do it that way. That like I would really love it if my students could do a resubmission on literally any piece of assessment they want. So that the first one is essentially a trial run. They take that feedback, and if they want, they can resubmit. But again, that would be really unfeasible. Like, it would work, but it would be super difficult with the resourcing that I actually have.
Yeah, and Ange in the chat has made a good point as well. Is that it's, you know, you can't just simply go to a pass-fail, right? There's need to do other things structurally, scaffolded wise, in terms of making sure that we're trying to still move away from mediocrity. And some of the things that you even mentioned there, Emma, about having choice in the assessment can promote more agency. Agency is typically more associated with effort. Effort over time typically leads to more creative challenge and seeking out more challenges. And Cherie's kind of backed that idea up as well. We can't just go to a pass-fail. It can simply just result in people promoting mediocrity. Ange, did you want to kind of make a comment on that? I see your hands up. You're really, oh, you're on mute, Ange, sorry. I was going to say, you're really quiet. No, you're on mute.
Sorry about that. Yeah, I just wanted to say that the policy with, for example, advanced German, I'm from the University of Adelaide, and because students have to write a lot of essays, the first essay that they submit, or the first version of their essay that they submit, is returned to them with, you know, annotations that indicate, oh, look, grammar was a problem here, or spelling, or and then the students submit a second version of the same essay, and having made the changes that they've been alerted to. And as a language teacher myself, I find this really, really good, because often you mark students' work and they only look at the mark. They don't look at how they can improve. But yeah, you know, because and sorry, I want to say also that the first version of the essay is worth 50%, and the second one that they submit is worth 50%. So they can really improve their marks. And I think that that is one way of encouraging students to take risks, but where they're able to, you know, especially using language that might be more sophisticated than they usually use. And I think that's actually quite a good approach. And it also makes students look at the errors that they've made and, you know, work to
great.
Repair them.
Yeah. And there's been a few comments in the chats around, you know, like the other parts of curriculum design that might support things like risk taking or these desirable difficulties, right? So Brendan's made a few comments around, you know, you could even design rubrics. You could have learning outcomes. I'm a big fan on making sure rubrics align with learning outcomes. I could imagine a world where a learning outcome actually aligns very closely with a rubric that talks about taking risks. I think that that's kind of a graduate attribute, sometimes more so than some of the content learning outcomes that go in. Joel, I think your hand is up, and I might leave you with the last comment and then we'll move on to the next part.
Yeah, the other thing I was thinking about is that if you include student assessment of each other as a key part of the assessment process, then learning to give valid and useful feedback to each other also challenges students to think about their own work and their own ways of learning and say, is this effective? How can I improve it?
Yeah, I'm a big fan of kind of the peer marking, both in the formative and summative space. So I will back you in on that one, Joel. Thanks for that comment. Okay, feel free to keep adding some stuff to the chat, and if you kind of want to bounce around in there, please have a go at that. But that's kind of the first kind of step, and I think most of you knew a lot of those persistent myths, so it's lovely to start there, have a bit of a discussion. And I think the reason why I wanted to start there is to move on to the next part. I think we are all very good at projecting, or not projecting, or very good at identifying the myths that students hold about learning. Sometimes we're not very good at kind of appreciating the myths that we hold about learning. And this is kind of now starting to move into the Inspire space a little bit. So I want to see if we can maybe use the momentum from our first part to carry on and encourage us all, and also be critical of me, but to be critical of our own ways of thinking, to be critical of maybe some of the myths that we hold about how learning occurs, and maybe if there are different ways of doing it. And the first way that I'm going to do that is through the science of learning with regards to presenting content, presenting information, maybe doing things like what you're seeing here in terms of the PowerPoint slide. There's so much research and science behind this. And sometimes, at least in my experience, the things that I've audited so many PowerPoint presentations in the last 6 months, the things that I'm going to show you are not common practice. As much as we say, yeah, we all do this, it's not. It's hands down not what we do. I've sat through conferences. It's not what we do. We think we do it, but we do not in a consistent and universal way, at least. So I'm going to talk about the do's and don'ts of presentation design, challenge us on our ways of thinking about how we put together presentations. I'm going to do this, hopefully, through talking about phone numbers, because the way that we present phone numbers to each other speaks to the idea that we know how learning occurs. We know how working memory in particular works. And presentations, talking like I am now, is encouraging you to use your working memory. So at the moment, the number one cognitive aspect of your brain, well, there's two, is your attention and your working memory. And they kind of feed off each other a little bit. So you know a lot about attention and working memory already. And I'm going to show you how much you know just by numbers. So I have a few questions for you. This is the first one. What is wrong with how I've presented this phone number? You all know what it is. What's wrong with it? Either take yourself off mute. First cab wins.
You've spelled the numbers out.
I have spelled the numbers out, right? There is a better way to represent what is on the slide, right? There is it's taxes too much working memory. Alexandra's done a great job of going kind of to the deep level of what's wrong here. So I should have done something like this, right? And maybe I shouldn't have done something like this, but we'll get to that in a second. But this is a better version of what it should look like. And some people are playing ahead. So that's cool. We'll get there. Hold your horses. So here's my first do. The first do, and there is so much research behind this, is to use relatable images or very few keywords on a slide. And we all know this from those kind of presentations that we sat through. And it's just like, am I supposed to read this whole monologue, or are they, what's the plan here? What's the scenario? And I'm hoping through this kind of presentation today, I role model some of these. Sometimes where I want kind of, key take home messages like this one, I want this all out there. So it's not a hard and fast rule. Don't get me wrong. If you had a learning activity for students to step through and it was kind of like a recipe, you would want to give that out in pretty good detail. So it's not to suggest that there's like a hard and fast here. But when we're presenting content for learning, we want to tap into working memory, get students to think about things and learn things. Fewer words, relatable images, and so numbers are an example of relatable images. Don't use large amounts of text unless there's a really good reason to do that, right? You've got a really particular definition that needs to be out there. You don't want to paraphrase it. It's kind of really key. I know humanities are sometimes really focus on those kinds of things. Or if there's a learning activity, you need to step it out what students need to do. Sure, use as much text as you want. So this is the example of the do's and don'ts in kind of, I'm getting very meta here. This is a slide within a slide, right? It's kind of Inception. But ignore this content. This is bad, right? That's not what we would do. This is the slide that you should get instead of the one that you just saw, right? Which is the idea that when you're presenting in front of students, we have two visual channels or two sensory channels that we principally use to access our working memory and our attention. There are a visual channel and our auditory channel. This is a flick back to our first myth, by the way. And we want to try to maximize both of those channels as much as possible. If we have large amounts of text on a slide, we are interrupting those channels, right? We're making them compete. Fewer texts with auditory explanation over the top is maximizing those channels. Okay, let's go back to our phone number. Some people have already alluded to this, so don't look at the chat. Someone tell me, what is still wrong with this number?
It's not chunked.
It's not chunked. Okay, so it should look a little bit more like this, right? Visually, that's how it should look. When I read it out, how do I read it out? How do I indicate the separation of the numbers? What would you do?
Pause.
You'd pause. Fantastic. So I'd say 0427 522 268. And I do this lovely thing with my voice and I go up and down, right? To kind of indicate the pace of things that are going on. You know this already. You know that you learn and you can access your working memory so much better when related information is chunked, right? Good job, everybody. I didn't teach you anything. Segmenting information is a much more meaningful way of learning, right? So that's our next do. Segment information on points, on slides, Video to video, if you're doing a lot of video learning, like I tend to do a bit more nowadays, class to class, topic to topic, unit to unit, right? We know that this is kind of good design. We just kind of forget it sometimes at a micro level. Reveal information as you present it, kind of what you're seeing me stuff up at the moment. But that kind of the pause part when we talk out phone numbers is the example of how we reveal information bit by bit. So it's not just about chunking, it's also about revealing. And so avoid kind of doing more than about 4 bits of information in one chunk, right? You may have heard of the rule of 7. That rule kind of holds up. Some more research is around the idea that our working memory has a rough capacity of about 4 bits, give or take 1 or 2 bits, right? And really think about students' working memory, right? They might have just come from a class. They might have had a fight with their partner. They might have been thinking about, well, I've got to do this other assessment. So their working memory is doing other things as well. It's not like, oh, it's just 7. We can chuck 7 bits of information. So again, really bad example. This is my inception version of what's going on here. So not really what you want to do, but that same information in a slide. So when we present 2 channels, try to maximize them, but be aware there's a limit to these channels. We can only stuff so much information in before it starts overloading and therefore doesn't have any effect. Interestingly, or perhaps importantly, this is something that you can also extend to feedback. And Alison Guido and Brendan and Marg will probably know this at ACU. I am really big on not giving a lot of feedback to students because they simply don't use it. They can't access that working memory. So the first 4 bits of information that you give is probably the limit. And it's not always the most critical bits of feedback, usually comes a little bit later, but you've already taken up working memory space, right? So students can't process information that comes after the 4 chunks. I'm being very, very kind of rule of thumbish, right? Change 4 to whatever makes sense in your context. Postgrads might have a bit more capacity depending on what they're learning, but not always. Okay. So this is our phone number. It looks a little bit better. My spacing isn't super good on this slide, but there's spaces, trust me, where you would expect to see spaces. So this time around, back over to the group. What's wrong here?
There is absolutely no indication of what order those numbers are meant to be read in. And also, for some reason, 6 now seems really important.
Yeah, I didn't even think of that. I just needed a space for 0 and I didn't want to put 0 where, you know, it would otherwise go. Okay, so Emma's kind of hit on the really good points here, which is that this is a really confusing presentation of information, particularly considering our mental model for a keypad, right? We've got a rough idea. If I look down at my keypad, it looks kind of what I would expect. You can see it upside down and all different ways, but you kind of have a mental model. 2 follows 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. 0 is somewhere floating around there. You'll find it if you really need it. But this is kind of talking to the idea that when we're presenting information, particularly graphical information, there's value in putting things in a space and in a time as well where they seem most sensible and logical, right? The closer the relatable parts of the content are together, the better the learning is going to be as a result of that. So don't push things apart from each other. Don't separate things out. And so to give you some examples of what I mean here, present information, really relatable parts close together. What we tend to do, which contradicts this science, is to use things like legends or separate parts out in a diagram, right? So legends are really tax working memory. I have to go to legend and come back to the figure, go to legend again, come back to the figure. So even that head movement is indicative of the working memory, the real cognitive cogs ticking over. So this is an example of what I mean by a legend. This is really taxing on your mental capacities, even though I've done hopefully a really reasonably good job of highlighting things, right? This is a really hard image to interpret and use your capacities as well as listen to what I'm saying, compared to an image that starts like this. And I'm going to start applying some of the other things that we've talked about, and then slowly indicates using what's called contiguity. So keeping things really close together, making it very obvious what I'm talking about. And I might talk about each of these as they come out, right? So I've used contiguity. I've spaced and timed things so that they're appropriate. I've reduced the amount of text on the slide. I would probably give a definition, at least of the function of these different areas of the brain if I was presenting it. And so you know this, right? Like this is kind of, even going from one slide to the other, I saw some faces go, oh yeah, that seemed a lot better. So these are kind of natural things I love people that are already kind of like, yeah, that's not all of the brain. I'm doing simplified versions. Thanks, thanks everybody. Oh, there we go, spinal cord. I had one more. Okay, I've got one more slide, and I know you guys definitely know what's wrong with this one. So I want to give you the number. What is wrong with what is on this slide? I want you to have my card.
Sorry.
Yeah, great, fantastic. So I'm going to hover over that. Sure, fantastic. It gives you a lot of information, but there's only really one piece of information that's really critical to learning here, right? So I am taxing your working memory again, and I am offsetting your attention with things that are not really important. They might be interesting, you know, particularly other fun numbers. We all like 88, great number, but you don't need to know that right now, right? What you really wanted to know is what my current number is, right? And maybe the current number should come first. I would argue that you don't need my previous number. There's no need for that, right? But there might be, to Joel's point, there's some value in thinking about hierarchy of presentation of information, particularly on web pages and things like that. Some good research. But there's a lot of erroneous things here. There's too much information and there's too much irrelevant information, right? So the do's and don'ts. Present the most important information first, right? That's kind of a really powerful message to take home here. Avoid the interesting but ultimately unimportant information. So avoid things like tangents and my absolute pet peeve, but someone in this room will say, but I love them, memes. Memes are distracting. If you want a meme for like a break or the last slide, you know, there's definitely, don't get me wrong, again, these are rules of thumb. You can put a meme in, you can put something funny in, you can tell a funny story, sure. But don't let that clog up the learning part of the lesson or what you're trying to get across, right? So definitely have fun and be humorous if that's your style. But don't do things like this, right? Don't present the brain on one side and then do a jokey meme on the other, because students will do a really well at remembering where the taco part of the brain is and forget where the occipital lobe is, right? Like that's the part that they remember. Stories and messages and humor is a lot easier to remember, and that can really clog up what's going on. So don't get me wrong, please use memes, please use jokes, please use funny things if that is your natural disposition, but you have to work a little bit harder than us boring people to think about where am I going to put that so it's not going to be distracting, so that it might be energizing, if anything else. Another example of where this can happen is in just purely slide design. So there's some really good research around what's called neutral space or white space in slide designs. I tried to do it. So if I go back a couple of slides, let's go to say this one. I try to maximize white space, right? It draws your eye in, it doesn't tax your working memory. It allows you to use your attention really well. Now, a lot of us, because we're exceptional learners, we've gone through the traps, we've done the higher education piece. We like this because we think it looks much more attractive to the eye. For a learner who is novice, this is much more taxing, and particularly for neurodiverse students, this is really confusing to have this level of color, this level of shapes, this level of information, right? So maximizing white space or neutral space in a slide is a real powerful tool for supporting learning, maximizing working memory. I got a little handout that I can share with Alice and Steve at the end of this, but just to sum up the do's and don'ts. Relatable images and keywords are fantastic. Avoid those big chunks, segment that information, and try to, not go more than kind of about 4 bits before you kind of go into other bits to a new slide or a new diagram or things like that. Reveal information as you present it, which you just saw. Look, I'll do it again. Present related information together, like all the do's on one side and all the don'ts on the other side. See how we're using a little bit of contiguity. And don't use legends or indices to indicate the separated related parts. And finally, keep your information clean, keep it neat, keep it direct. Yes, carve out other spaces in your classes to have fun, or when you're working with students, make sure that there is your natural feel coming through, but be really kind of conscious about the idea that when you present a lot of information that's unimportant, you can distract people, you can overtax their working memory. I'm going to stop there. That's the second part. There is so much research, and I'm going to I didn't put references in here because the next part's going to kind of reveal where you can get some of that information yourself. So I'm going to stop there. What are people's thoughts, comments, concerns? Someone will definitely teach English as a second language students and have a comment to say here. So I welcome those comments. There's also some good research in that area, which I haven't included in these slides. So over to the group, and I'll look through the chat, but what do people think? what are their reflections on the do's and don'ts that you can see on the screen?
Just to note that I'm very excited because I am literally in the final stages of amending the class for first years about how to do oral presentations. And I'm very glad to know that there's nothing in the presentation that is very wrong for the students. That a few of the things that you've talked about have helped me think about different ways to present that information to the students. It's very meta, particularly the hierarchy of information and thinking about prioritizing information and how I then do that to present that same concept to the students was really helpful. So thank you.
That's great. And look, I think one of the biggest challenging points here, Emma, is doing a hierarchy. And I probably haven't really even thought about the hierarchy here. If I was a little bit better, I would have thought, well, what is actually the most important do here? Really, but I got a funny feeling in the literature, it might have actually just been lucky and I got the first one right. But I might be wrong. But I think that that's even for students, right? If you're thinking about, well, how would a student maybe apply this in a presentation? A real advanced student, or your kind of high distinction students, for want of a better way of saying it, will probably be able to work out what is more of a priority. What is the higher level knowledge here, and presenting that first. Whereas I imagine students who are still kind of grappling with understanding would struggle, I guess, from a solo taxonomy, for those in the know with that kind of idea, they would probably struggle to connect what is more important and maybe less of a priority in the presentation.
John, I reckon everything you say here is spot on, absolutely on the nail. And having worked in academic skills advising for quite a while now, I reckon a lot of academic skills advisors are really across this stuff really well, about what you say about segmenting and revealing and not putting too much stuff up on the slide, and less is more type of philosophy. I reckon where the problem lies a lot of the time, I see it, is with the academics. God bless them, they tend to put a stack of stuff up on their slides, and I'm looking at slides like my daughter's looking at and think, oh my God, really? So it seems to me the less is more doesn't get through to the people who actually need to really hear it. They seem to be really bad at it, to be honest.
And this is what, like if people kind of are really savvy with something I'm going to talk about in a second about cognitive biases, this is a curse of knowledge, right? Academics, and I think that there is probably a kernel of truth to this, know their content really, really, really well. They've forgotten how hard it was to learn everything that they know, right? Their impression of what they know is like, oh, this is kind of easy and, this makes sense. But they've only done, 10 years of study and another 20 years of working in the field, right? So the jump back to what it's like to be 18, 19 and learning this for the very first time is so distant from their memory, their long-term memory in this case, of what it's actually like. So the challenge here is to really engage academics with a lot of what I try to do, engage academics in role modeling what it looks like to, like even in the group, when I saw nods, it's like, that's what I'm looking for when I'm working with academics. The more nods I see in the room, it's that kind of light bulb moment of going, oh, I put a lot of text on my slides. And there is space. There is definitely times that you do that. But Steve, I'm doing a really big project at the moment, and we did a lot of capacity building around something as simple as what to put on slides. And now I'm looking back at everything, I'm going, nah, they didn't do it. No. It's easier to just brain dump onto a slide and hopefully everything works out, right? So there's a time limit factor. There's a curse of knowledge factor. The pre-existing knowledge piece that Mandy's talked about. So yeah, I think that those are really good points. Anybody else have reactions or thoughts about what's going on? There was a comment around boring white slides or distracting pictures. Boring white slides for the win, 100%. It is boring to us, but lots of different things going on a slide is distracting for students. So you have to kind of settle yourself with the sense that you think it's boring and not kind of creep into what we were just talking about when Steve was talking about, like this curse of knowledge thing, right? Don't get caught up with the idea of your experiences are the exact same as students. And
sorry, yeah. You're muted.
Myself off mute, sorry. John, yeah, fantastic. I really love this. It's so clear and rational. But I'm also really interested in the power of association to take the burden off working memory at the time and later too, in terms of recall. And, you know, presentation, as you say, you know, is using more sort of senses than, you know, just a sheet of paper handed out. So, yeah, I don't know if you've got any comments there, but especially for language learners, you know, memory aids and things, yeah, they will recall that after the presentation.
Yeah, and
you know.
The only part that I can really add, and I'm not going to pretend to be the expert, particularly with language learners and English as second language, but the number one piece of research that comes out to support learners, English as a second language, people who might have learning difficulties, people who might be hard of hearing, is the value of adding transcription to slides or to presentations. That is probably been the number one thing that I really value about what we've done at ACU in the last 6 months, is that we have invested time and money into getting audio equipment that will ensure about a 99% accuracy with our transcriptions. And so before, you know, if I'm recording this, you can watch this recording back and you will see the transcription. It'll be close to 70% accurate, right? It's pretty awful in Zoom and Teams and a lot of just web-based kind of things. So there is a need for universities to really think about their investment in those technology so that they are supporting all learners. And it is a good way to talk about that association, about, you know, recall and using transcriptions in novel and creative ways. I love transcriptions. I love closed captions. The technology is there. It's probably just a bit underutilized, but it really does support students with English as second language. It really delivers on some of the UDL principles as well. So it seems so easy sometimes. It's literally clicking a button on in a lot of technologies. So I don't know if that goes in any way of answering that, Angela, if you have any kind of reactions or responses to that.
Yeah, I was thinking more, you know, in terms of content and engaging the content, you know, sometimes and that's where visuals or videos are can be so powerful. Because, you know, how many students walk away from a lecture and they will only recall it if they then need to draw on that for an assignment, you know, and yeah, so the power of the presentation, you know.
I agree. Like this does, it always speaks to a bigger picture, right? None of this stuff exists in isolation. And actually a lot of these principles you can apply to things like web design. A lot of web design research basically mimics the exact same findings that you're seeing here, because it's using cognitive load, it's using working memory, it's using attention. So it's not surprising there. There is one piece of research that is hot off the press this week that looks at video-based learning, and it looked at 3 moderators. It looked at gestures, which showed that indicative gestures. So if I'm doing anatomy and I say, okay, so your forearm, so that would be an indicative gesture. If I use pointing gestures, so if I was superimposed on the slide, I could point to them, but I'm not currently. We're really good for learning. Beat gestures, which I use a lot. This is a beat gesture when you're just kind of doing mannerisms, have no effect on learning. Eye gaze was really important. So I know that in our studios, a lot of our staff are looking off because they're looking at their notes. That's a simple solution in terms of fixing that. And then the other one was emotive facial expressions. I don't know how good I am at emotive facial expressions, so I might not be the best role model. But you think about, you know, what it's like trying to engage with a presentation that's very deadpan versus a presentation that has a little bit of life in the face. So there's some really cool research, and it's just, I agree, Ange. Presentations, video-based presentations especially, has such power. It does have a place in the bigger curriculum design aspect as well. So all of this has to feed together, of course. If I'm going to present content, I want to make sure that it's aligned somehow with the learning objective, and then somewhere along the lines, it'll also be assessed.
I'm going to break in for a second, John, to address a couple of things quickly, if I may.
Yes.
Alexandra asked about slides. We will make the slides of John's PowerPoint and also the recording available on the AALL site. So please look there. There's a section called PD events and so on, and look for the Connect Inspire Share program. And also, John, about the point that people are making about making it more visually attractive. At ACU, in your presentation there, you did address using icons and using animation to make things a little bit less tedious for students and make things pop out more. Maybe you can if you mind talking about that.
Yeah, the animation piece talks a little bit to, I haven't reveal information as you present it. There's some good research as well around the language that you use. So trying to make understandably language relatable, but tends to be a focus on things like personalizing the language. So when you talk about, say it's biology, you might talk about the brain compared to your brain. So your brain has a better learning outcome than using the brain. So personalized language energizes cognition, keeps people engaged more. Anthropomorphisms in terms of images. So if you're doing cell biology and you've got a little cell and it's a literal cell, image of a cell, it's not as memorable or it's not as cognitively energizing as if you put a little smiley face on that cell. So there's some really good research. Things that I find really surprising. I'm like, oh, that kind of sounds like it's distracting, but there's kind of good kinds of ways of engaging that you have to really understand how the brain works and how memory works to draw associations and how we really maximize working memory. So, I mean, like neuroscience is arguably one of the better researched areas in psychology. It's received a fair bit of information, particularly and because it carries over from psychology to a little bit, well, definitely a lot in medicine, to learning. So there's a lot of players who are interested in neuroscience. And so it has a lot of research on it. Shall I press on? I feel like I've only got a little bit of time left, right? How much longer do I have, Alice? Half an hour?
About 15, 20 minutes.
Excellent. That's just about enough time. So the last two things, or the first two things I've really talked about are in service of the last point here. The first two things that I'm really focusing on is about the decisions that we make. The first one was about the decisions that students make. So the decision to highlight or the decision to take notes. And then the second point that we talked about were the decisions that academics make or educators make or instructors make, or maybe you make in terms of how do I present information? And I know we don't just present information, right? We do a lot of different things. My question is, how do we make better decisions quicker and more often? Now, the information I just presented about slides includes literature from about, I'm going to wager a guess here and say something close to 15 meta-analyses. Now, if you don't know what a meta-analysis is, it usually pulls the best available primary research in a field. So 15 meta-analyses probably accounts for something like, let's wager a guess that they probably have about a couple of hundred papers, right? A couple of hundred primary studies. That is an enormous amount of literature to read. And I don't think anybody in this room is going to willingly put up their hand and say, let me read that. I want to be the first person that reads that, right? So my kind of key question to the group is, if we didn't know all of the do's in the slide from a couple of slides back, and we were starting out and we were doing all of the don'ts, what would we have needed? What would we need access to? What kind of environments would we need in order to make better decisions in learning and teaching? Does anybody have any ideas? What do we need to make better decisions?
If you didn't have access to that information, and if you couldn't intuitively work it out, which I think is what a lot of people do, I think you need the power of self-reflection. You've got to be able to work out what's happening in a teaching situation or an educative situation and think to yourself, this is not working. Maybe I'm putting too much information, or I'm speaking too fast, or I'm not animating, things like that.
Yeah, great. So you need like a little bit of feedback and to allow you to do some self-reflection, right? You need some kind of sources of information to allow you to reflect on what's happened. And just maybe Steve's first point, I'm not saying you don't have access to this information. I'm just thinking that we're probably not going to go out and read 200 bits of primary research or even probably 20 meta-analyses, right? But if that's kind of a source of information, what would we need in order to get that information more quickly so that we can make better decisions? So Mark said that we need literature. We also need to consider specific learning contexts, get some feedback, get learners' voice into it. So they're good examples.
We need you to present it to us in a concise way. Like
Yeah,
we
we
do
need
now.
something that's, no, I agree, Sheree. We need something that's digestible, right? Like even as a psychologist who does a lot of reading, oh my God, they're sometimes so boring, those things. So we need something that's kind of more accessible, easy to hand. When we get it, it's digestible. Tell me about, if I just gave you a summary of a meta-analysis, is that all you need? What's the problem with just giving you that? Someone's got their hand up. Alexandra.
I would need examples. I learned from examples of seeing how it's been applied. That's how I learn.
Wonderful. So we need kind of concrete examples, right? We don't want kind of people just talking about, now when you put a slide together, make sure, you know, you don't reveal any seductive details. Like, well, what does that look like? You know, hopefully the examples I gave before tap into what Alexandra was talking about. I could have just done all the do's and don'ts, but I think the thing is more likely to stick with you is the way that hopefully the way that I step things through. So having some examples, some scaffolded opportunities, some learning opportunities, all of those kind of things. Cool. It's not like I didn't prepare for this at all. So to summarize some of those things, to try to make this and to align it with some of the research in the area around how we engage in better decisions, more evidence-based decisions, more informed decisions. One thing that we could have is a toolkit for all of this information, right? And not just like a basic toolkit, right? Not just something that gives you a bibliography of research or, you know, does a summary in an abstract form. That would be really annoying, right? We need a toolkit that gives us simple and concrete strategies that is based on best available evidence. We need those meta-analyses, those primary research papers to be converted and translated into a way that make them almost, if not exactly, immediately useful, right? So we need the kind of do's and don'ts. Instead of, you know, reading whole papers on segmentation and contiguity and seductive detail, we want to know something as simple as don't put memes on slides. That's the concrete part, right? But that's the summary of all of the research, well, a large part of the research on seductive detail. That's kind of one part. And then the other part was kind of talking, someone mentioned kind of the scaffolding process or the kind of idea that you can develop and you can get recognized for that development and the time that you spend on something, right? So this idea that you're learning and that learning is meaningful as a process. Well, this very conveniently feeds into, it's like I planned it, leads into the Inspire project. And so I'm going to bring up the Inspire project and I will chuck this in the chat. Here it is. So you can play along at home. You can play along at your own discretion. This is a work in progress. It is getting updated, polished every day, but it is intended as an evidence center for higher education. So any person in higher education that needs to make a decision that impacts student learning and some adjacent student outcomes can come here and say, well, what does the best available evidence say? And then apply that evidence in their context. So we give some examples just to give you a flavor, but the idea is that you take that away and think, okay, well, how does this apply to public health? How does this apply to law? How does this apply to medicine? How does this apply to academic skills? How does this apply to library? How does this apply to whatever the context is, foundation studies, English as second language, right? So it's not a complete, we're not going to tell you how to do everything for your job. That's impossible. There's too many contexts and there's too many nuances. What we want to provide is a summary of the best available evidence so that you can make meaningful decisions. So instead of going to Google Scholar and getting, I think it's about 5 million hits when you type in learning higher education, you can have a toolkit of easy resources. We've got 2 toolkits. Ripple is for clinical education. So if you or your colleagues work in particular in healthcare, that might be an interesting one to look at. But the one I really want to focus on is the Educator Toolkit. It's our main baby. And what the Educator Toolkit does is it has a series of different summaries, evidence summaries. It talks about the impact. So if you were to use this based on all of the research that's available, the best available research that's available, what likely impact will it have on student learning? Contiguity, this is ordered in order of impact. Contiguity has a really big impact, so does simulation, so does scaffolding. And if you come all the way down to the bottom here, hey, here's our little learning design one, really has kind of almost sometimes a negative impact on student outcomes. And people will immediately be drawn to this and go, right, no, group assignment. So I'm going to skip over that, but we can come back to it if you want. And then we also rate the quality of the research in this area. So in this case, the research on contiguity, which is that, you know, the diagram of the brain that said temporal lobe, occipital lobe, that's contiguity, keeping things together in time and space. The research around that topic is really, really healthy. There's really good research. People have been very rigorous when they've studied this particular topic. So instead of maybe picking one that we've picked before, let's go to something like feedback, which is always kind of one of my favorites. It's quite universal. It's very accessible. Massive impact on learning. Unsurprising. This is out of 5, I should say. And the research around it is very good. You can click on these things and you can get if you're interested in the HEAs, the UK PSF, we've kind of coded these according to their dimensions. But basically, it tries to distill the big pieces of research into a couple of points. So the research on feedback says, give feedback quickly, probably not surprising. When you provide feedback on errors, explain what the error is, why it's an error, which is the #1 thing that we often forget to do. So why is it actually important to fix this, or why is the alternative a better option? And also how to fix it. Don't give them the answer, tell them how to go about trying to fix or solve the answer. And then when giving negative or critical feedback, couple it with praise, focus on their criteria, and give it in person. So there's more detail that follows, but you could basically stop here. If that makes sense to you, you could go, great, that's what the best available evidence says. What would I do in my context? How would I apply that? Off I go. 3 points. Then there is more information about, what the topic is about, what the evidence says, goes into a little bit more detail. The underlying theories that might inform these particular topics. A lot of you will be familiar with these theories. The summary of the evidence. So as you go down, I'm trying to use a little bit of hierarchical priorities. So I'm kind of thinking less people care about where the quality comes from, but some of the researchy folks will really be pernickety about that. And then the literature. So in this case, there are 4 meta-analyses, and I think that there's probably close to about 300 primary studies that is informing this one page, right? There is a lot of research that's been summarized on this page, all for you, publicly accessible. And so it's a knowledge translation piece, right? It's with the intention of being a conduit between those really big, dense academic papers and the groundwork, and you've only got 5 minutes to do something, right? I want to know really, if I'm going to give feedback, what should I really do? And so you can kind of go through this at your own discretion. There's learning environments, so you can filter learning design. You have to untick that. Presentation, which is a lot of the things that we talked about. So signaling, spoken language, modality, seductive detail. Those are the ones that we went through today. So all of those papers are here. And assessment and feedback. So it's hopefully kind of a cool tool. I'm going to stop there because I feel like I may have pushed my time a little bit, but you've got this link, and maybe we can open the floor to some questions or comments or concerns even. It is very much like John Hattie's work. I agree, Miriam. The extension from John Hattie is that we hopefully are, and even John would kind of acknowledge this, is that we are trying to go to the translation piece a lot more. I think John kind of did an excellent job of being systematic about systematic reviews. And now we're kind of trying to apply that process a little bit to higher education. And there's been some really good research, particularly in health, particularly in the UK, around how you get people to adopt evidence-based practices, right? There's some really cool science of using science. If you're interested in the report, it's so cool.
We still have about 10 minutes, John. So, and everyone else. So please ask away. There might have been some questions that were missed in chat before. Just looking through. Or if there's a question that wasn't answered by John already and you put in chat, could you speak on the microphone?
Thanks, Ben.
I'm trying to find the hand up icon and I can't, so I'm just going to speak. I just wanted to ask, I was too busy looking at your website and I probably missed something of what you said, but you said it's a work in progress. How far have you progressed through? How much bigger and more complex is it going to get?
It's how big is a piece of string? Okay, so the #1 thing that we're working on at the moment is the transparency behind the summaries. So we're going to have a really ugly Excel spreadsheet for all the nerds out there that are like, yeah, but how did you get this effect size? That was my nerd voice, if anybody was wondering. So that's a massive piece of work, because when we kind of first developed the toolkit, we just kind of worked pretty quick and we said, okay, this has this effect size. That's a 4 pluses or 5 pluses or 3 pluses. And we didn't journal that, which is what we should have done, because if people come and say, well, where is this effect size? We can't directly point them to, we have to go all the way back and manually pull it out again. So that's the first thing we're doing. The next thing that we're doing is doing what is now a 3rd sweep of meta-analyses in higher education. We do have a time limit in terms of how far back we will go. You know, there's been so many evolutions in higher education, particularly recently, and then probably another evolution that we're starting or halfway through or something like that now. So we don't want to necessarily present things that might be a little bit outdated, but we will sweep, for example, we don't have a summary on flipped classrooms, and there is a ton of meta-analyses on flipped classrooms that should be in there. We have talked about even doing a student toolkit, which talks about some of the myths. So, you know, how should you take notes? How should you prepare for exams? What's the value of things like concept maps? That's a massive undertaking. So there's so many things we could do. Our main focus is for the educator toolkit, sharpening up the transparency so that people who want to know more about it can get that information, and then extending onto the things that we feel are missing. There's probably a good 10 summaries that I think are missing. VR is missing. Like I said, flipped classrooms is missing. People in this room will probably know some other good ones that are missing.
AI.
So we can fill it out a bit. AI could be in there, yeah, for sure.
Yeah. So obviously this is going to keep you in work for the rest of your life. Because it's going to be an ongoing thing, isn't it? For it to be a resource, you know, that lasts.
Yeah. And look, what we're exploring at the moment is how this becomes more of a community. Like at the moment, there's about half a dozen of us that contribute to this site, but we've kind of done a good job now of simplifying the process of, well, how do you find research? How do you summarize that? How do you put it into the toolkit? And we kind of, I feel like within the next 18 months, we'll get to a point where, and this isn't for ACU, this is for the whole sector, we want people as part of their scholarly work in the field, making contributions to the toolkit, making their own summaries, getting acknowledged as being an author in the toolkit, being able to then, you know, build capacity as a whole of community. This definitely shouldn't be the John show. If it does, it'll fall over very quickly. We kind of need a whole community to really push and sell and communicate best available practice. So yes, hopefully it keeps me in for a while yet.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Cherie. Alex, I think you were next, and then Steve.
Yeah, so you answered part of the question I had. You said that there were about half a dozen people working on this. I was wondering about how long and how much time of your work week did you devote to this? And
when we started Inspire, this is going to be a tangential story. When we started Inspire, I just had my second kid. Well, my wife had it. I was there for the presentation. And so I had a lot of sleepless nights. And so a lot of that sleepless night was kind of spent building it. So don't ask how long it took, how much time it was spent. That's probably an immeasurable piece. But Inspire has been in existence now for just over 2 years. We probably launched the initial beta site 2 years ago. And the idea was to pilot this with like 20 staff. And when we put it out, 200 staff at ACU came back and said that they wanted to have a go at it. We had applied for a $12,000 teaching grant, and the provost chucked us $60,000 instead. And so it's just kind of been this swan song story of beauty that just keeps growing. And don't get me wrong, there's definitely some flaws to it. You know, we've been accused of being positivist and not acknowledging postmodern ways of understanding and things like that. Oh, sure, yeah, 100%. We're not trying to solve everything here. There's no silver bullet in higher ed. We're trying to fill a hole, which is that we don't have easy access to best available evidence, and you shouldn't blindly and aggressively follow empirical evidence at all. That's just as bad as ignoring it altogether. So we're just trying to start the discussion about, well, how should we do feedback and how should we design scaffolded activities? What does good simulation look like? So yeah, definitely a long process, but a good process. When it's a passion pit, you forget time, right? And you just kind of get into a fun state of flow. Steve.
It may sound like I've got a thing in for academics. I don't. Some of my best friends are academics, but it really seems to me that the people who really need to hear what you are saying, John, are academics who, whether they like it or not, if they're in a teaching space, they are in a teaching space, and they are teachers, and they are there to teach, not just to pass on information. And a lot of what you are saying, a lot of what's in your Inspire website, which is brilliant, by the way, they do really need to hear this. So how do you get it in front of people who do need to hear it?
Yeah, I'm very lucky at ACU that we have a provost, a deputy provost, a director of Centre of Education and Innovation, and dare I even say a VC, who couldn't do more to support this work from on top. Heads of schools and other players kind of in the middle area are, definitely not getting in our way. They've been very supportive as well. So that's been a community bit that I didn't have to do anything about. We were lucky that ACU does that. I know that that's not always the case in every university. Some universities are maybe even better. That's wonderful. But to kind of say, well, what did we take control of? I mentioned before that there's this beautiful Science of Using Science report. I think if you Googled Science of Using Science, you'll find it. And they've made 3 different versions of it. One is like a technical report, really long. It's like 90 pages. One's a kind of summary report, and then one's kind of a manual. Like, how do you actually get people to engage based on evidence? How do you get people to engage in adopting new practices? And so there's different stages. One is about communication. One is about applying. One is about systemic change. So to get some examples, the application piece was about one of the things from the evidence around how do you get academics, for example, to use this, was giving them internal and external drivers. So we started creating certificates. We started working with our policy in terms of promotion, academic promotions, to have the use of evidence to inform teaching practices as a criteria for getting promoted at ACU, which is just coming out this week or the next couple of weeks. So at our university, it's going to be hard to get promoted in a teaching space if you're not doing something like Inspire, right? It's easier to do that than to not do it. So that's part of the kind of the application piece. The policy piece around promotions is more systemic. So that's kind of one piece of it. To your point, Steve, one thing that I was really disappointed with this year was that we want to present Inspire at HRSA, and we have data on 200 staff, and we got downgraded from a presentation to like a discussion forum, which is kind of fine. Like, it's great that we can communicate this, but I'm a part of another 3 presentations that are really, really, really embryonic, and they got all presentations. So even in and maybe it was how we put together the abstract. There could be a lot of things, but the way my initial reaction to that was kind of like, geez, HRSA doesn't even value, a whole of institution approach to evidence-based practice and learning and teaching, where 200 academic staff have engaged in this, and we've got pretty rigorous research and evidence behind it. Like, I thought that was a little bit telling for me, and maybe there's other things outside of it. I think I'm living in a microcosm of happy, fun, good times at ACU, and it maybe doesn't always exist outside of it. But look, invite me along to your university. I'm happy to do as many presentations as I can. I love this stuff. It's publicly accessible. We've got a micro that people can engage in as well. We've got some asynchronous training. They get a certificate when they do it. There's heaps of things. And if you see opportunities, collaboration, or things that we've missed, let us know. We want this to definitely be a community piece. So
speaking of that, John, speaking of collaboration, there was a couple of comments about how do they get involved in Inspire, or would you like them to get in direct contact with you, or how would you like to?
Yeah, you can. Let me just quickly share my screen again. But you can do a number of different things. I go back to there it is. So there is contacts, which you can contact us and it'll come through. I think if Alice, if you haven't already, please feel free to share my email. But the other thing that you can do if you just want to do something asynchronously is ignore the micro-credential, or you can sign up for the micro-credential if you want. But you can do this. It's like a 16-minute training, and you complete a little 10-question multi-choice quiz at the end of it, and you get a certificate, albeit from ACU. If you're interested in RIPE, you can do I've got to change it to Ripple. You can do that one as well if you're in clinical education and things like that. So you can do some stuff, see if you really like it, if you really want to reach out. I'd suggest spend 15 minutes doing the video-based training, and if you like it, yeah, by all means, reach out. If you want to collaborate, if you identify that there's a summary missing and you want to work with us on developing a summary, if you want us to come present at your respective universities with your groups, I'd be more than willing and happy to. I think it's, yeah, great that you're even thinking about it. I think Joel's got his hand up.
So a comment that I wanted to make, listening to what you're saying, John, and listening to some of the key factors behind what I think is success in ACU. I worked in an organisation where part of staff training was to do some action research on what worked well. My background knowledge of action research was about organizational change, and this was presented as what can you as an individual teacher do in your classroom that's going to improve your teaching. And I didn't get that that was actually about being more successful within the organization. And in fact, we had quite an autocratic organization that would have resisted teachers making organizational change. So I think you need the environment where the organization is saying, how can we do it better? And what can we do to support you to find ways of us as an organization doing it better and working as an organization on that, rather than just lip service to this as a great policy.
Yeah, no, I agree that there's the more and more I have dialogue with my friends and colleagues at other universities, the more I do realize that we're in a little bit of a golden period. I don't know if my colleagues from ACU will agree with this, but we seem to be in a little bit of a golden period with learning and teaching opportunity. Internally, in particular, at ACU. I don't think we've necessarily scaled to the external space just yet. And it's kind of, it almost seems blasphemous to come from a Catholic university and say this, but there's kind of like a holy trinity at the moment in terms of the work that the provost, the VC, and the director of Center for Education and Innovation are doing, that it's all very harmonious and trying to push something. And that is rare. We're going to lose our provost. She's retiring at the end of the year. And so this could all go tits up next year. It could all kind of get whitewashed. I'm hoping it doesn't, because the VC has carriage over it a little bit. The director has carriage over it, but I'm very aware that it's a sensitive thing. So you got to try to, when it's right and you can get it up and you can get momentum behind it, then it's great. But I appreciate that it's not always usable. And maybe that's why it's good to collaborate across universities, where some other universities do have these opportunities, and people can piggyback that until a time that their university can come across.
On that note, if we don't mind closing the session, and thank John for a really wonderful, engaging, useful presentation. We do big clap. Thank you so much, John. And hopefully we get more conversations going around the different topics that were presented today. Just looking ahead to the next Connect Inspire session, it will be July 12th of July. Sorry, I'm saying in American way. 12th of July, which is a Wednesday again at the same time. And the next session topic will be on AI and large language model use. What insights can come from all teams, and how do we ensure we're developing, sharing these insights? So back to the artificial intelligence side of things that's been occupying our minds. But I think this was a refreshing change, John, for our topic today. So thank you again very much. And then also I'll put in chat for people who are interested in the AALL conference coming up in November. John, this might be another way to disseminate. We will have an online conference this time, and I put the link in there. Submissions are due the 4th of June. There could be papers or workshops or what's the other format? I forget, but there are 3 different formats. Okay, so please check that out. And the last thing, thanks very much everyone for coming, and please help spread the word about Connect, Inspire, and Share.